simplemente dar la bienvenida a todos los participantes en este seminario, agradecer a los ponentes su colaboración y, en fin, desear que sea una jornada fructífera en esta línea que la red pues, ha emprendido de seminarios online que nos permiten poner a disposición los trabajos que estamos realizando. Quiero en este caso, I want to thank Maarten Prak for his collaboration in this seminar. I am sure your input will be very interesting and it will be helpful for all us. Y nada más, paso la palabra a José Nieto si quiere introducir a Maarten Prak para que empecemos este seminario. Vayamos ya al trabajo. José.
¿Se oye?
Sí, sí.
Sí. Bueno, Maarten es profesor de Historia Social y Económica en el Departamento de Historia e Historia del Arte de la Universidad de Utrecht, en los Países Bajos. Es un experto en historia moderna temprana, habiendo sido autor y editor de numerosas publicaciones sobre la historia nacional holandesa, la historia comparada en Europa y la historia global. Su labor investigadora se ha centrado en temas como la ciudadanía, instituciones, industrias culturales, gremios, capital humano, y su última monografía se titula Ciudadanos sin naciones, ciudadanía urbana en Europa y el mundo entre los años 1000 y 1789, editada en Cambridge University Press en el año 2018. Esta es una aportación, digamos, individual, pero Maarten ha publicado bastantes cosas desde un punto de vista colectivo, y este es el último libro, lo tiene también él ahí, Apprenticeship in Europe, que es un intento de recopilar todo lo que ha sido las diferentes investigaciones de un grupo de investigadores a lo largo de todo el continente europeo en la Edad Moderna. Bueno, en el pasado ha sido profesor invitado en varias universidades de Francia, de Alemania y también del Reino Unido. Ha presidido la Junta de Humanidades de la Organización Holandesa para la Investigación Científica y ha tenido también hasta septiembre del 2020 el cargo de miembro de la Junta Directiva de la Real Academia de las Artes y las Ciencias de los Países Bajos. Thank you, Maarten, for agreeing to participate in this seminar, and thank you for Elvira for the translation. You are the word.
Okay, thank you, Jose, and the organizers for inviting me, and thank you, Elvira, for helping us to overcome any language issues. I'm going to try and share my screen, so give me a second and I will... Okay, and hopefully you are now able to see my PowerPoint. Is that correct? Jose, if you can nod your head.
We can see it clearly.
Okay, very good. So what I am going to do is talk for about 35, maybe 40 minutes about this topic. I am not a labor historian, I have to emphasize. I am a historian of crafts, and because craft is also labor, I think there is hopefully a significant interest in what I'm going to say. Let me introduce this by one very general observation, and then go into my lecture. The underlying idea of my paper today is that between roughly 1400 and 1800, so roughly before the Industrial Revolution, craftsmen and women in Europe were able to create a sort of revolution in the production of craft products that have been largely unnoticed in the historiography of industrialization. And one example that we could think of is the making of clocks. So in 1400, clocks are a very unusual, huge and expensive object, which are only available to either very rich people or public institutions. Think of town halls or churches. by 1800, clocks, now in the shape of watches, are oh, wait a minute, something is going wrong here, are available to individuals, even very ordinary people. There are complaints about servants who own watches, and obviously this is only possible because the producers of these clocks had been able to reduce the size of these objects, but also, and perhaps more importantly, their prices. So from a very rare and inaccessible product, the clock has become a very common and accessible product. And the question underlying my paper is, how were craftsmen and women capable of achieving this? Now, I want to start, I'll come to all kinds of general processes, but I want to start by looking at one individual craftsman in particular. Not a very ordinary craftsperson, but somebody who embodies a lot of what I want to talk about later in the paper. And that individual is Albrecht Dürer. I would argue a very famous artist in the late 15th and early 16th century in Germany, but who was also a craftsman and comes from the crafts environment, because being born in Nuremberg in southeastern Germany, this craftsman grew up in a family of craftsmen. His father was a goldsmith, and initially he was also trained to become a goldsmith. However, halfway through his apprenticeship, it became very clear that he was perhaps even more talented to become a visual artist. And so he switched from an apprenticeship in goldsmithing to an apprenticeship in the world of painting and drawing. And of course, the two were related because goldsmiths were also sort of designers, and as such, they were trained to draw the products that they wanted to make. So there is a connection between the two. One of the important elements of the apprenticeship in Germany in general, but also in the individual biography of Albrecht Dürer, is that you were supposed to complete your education by traveling to other locations than the one where you were being trained. So at the end of his apprenticeship, Dürer traveled to other places, notably Colmar on the French-German border, and also Basel, and now in Switzerland. And then, by the way, also already in Switzerland, but of course part of the Germanic world, to complete his training, particularly as an engraver. And later he would travel to Italy. He would go there twice for extended periods, and also when he was already active and famous, to the Low Countries. Now, what is interesting about Dürer's biography is that he becomes a sort of superstar artist. When you read his diary about the trip to the Low Countries, you can see how he is received and celebrated in the Low Countries, not only by fellow artists, but also by all kinds of patrons of the arts who want to wine and dine him and hear his stories, and then of course perhaps buy his products. And that is also an interesting aspect of his biography, because Albrecht Dürer was not only a successful artist, but he was also a very keen businessman who, for instance, in Italy took competitors to the court for plagiarizing his products. One of the interesting aspects of Dürer is that he developed his own trademark, designed from his initials, which were imprinted. I'll show an example in a minute. Another interesting aspect of his biography is that he had various humanist friends, so people from the world of learning, in particular two quite famous humanist scholars in Germany, who both lived in Nuremberg and who were very important for his career. So Pirkheimer, the second mentioned here, was the person who sent him to Italy. Pirkheimer was a scholar of Latin and Greek, but he had lots of connections in Italy, and he encouraged Dürer to go there and also made those contacts available to him. Pirkheimer also had a sort of salon in Nuremberg where other humanists would come, and Dürer also would regularly be among the participants. And one of the ways in which this influenced his art was because these people talked about various topics that would then be used by Dürer to think of new topics for his engravings and his paintings. Dürer became famous, and I see that I should have inserted here some numbers which I failed to do. I apologize for that. If you look very carefully, you can see his trademark over here, but you find it on all his prints. One of the things that Dürer became famous for was his capacity to create lifelike, naturalist, if you will, images in his engravings, in his paintings. So one of the great aspects of this particular engraving is how the light is reflected not only in the glass window over here, but also on the wooden window frame over here. And this is very cleverly done. Here we see how, and this will come back later in my talk, this particular artist was capable of creating images that gave a very detailed and lifelike picture of the subject that he was showing in his picture. And this also applies, for example, to the lion here, although all of us are aware that lions don't look quite like this. The fact that Dürer never saw a lion for real, there was no zoo in Nuremberg where you could actually see lions, but he is nonetheless capable of doing quite a good job at depicting the lions. And a third aspect I would like to point out is that although the linear perspective in this room is not quite correct, this is not corrected, depicted in quite the correct way, you can already see how Dürer is doing a relatively proper job at depicting space in this image. Still another aspect of Dürer's career that is important to my story is the fact that he published he published 2 books, and he wrote a third one which remained unpublished for some time. But he wrote a couple of books that we would now call manuals for colleagues, also competitors. One is about geometry, the 4 books on measurement, but it's actually 1 book, and another one on human proportions. And here I show a picture from one of those, the pages from that second book, in which Dürer, in quite elaborate detail, shows how you should picture the human form in 2 dimensions. Clearly a female figure here. The book is subdivided into men and women, old and young, and he shows in, as I said, very great detail and with companion text on the other page, how the human figure should be proportioned. Now, Dürer is an example of a much wider process that I will discuss in the rest of this paper under the heading of the Industrial Evolution. And in earlier versions of the papers, I called this the Artisan Revolution, but it's actually not a revolution because it took such a long time. And the core of my argument about the industrial evolution has to do with human capital and skills that I will spell out in greater detail in the paper. But first, I'd like to give you some background. And the background consists of 2 elements. One is the role of human capital in innovation, and the other one is the so-called consumer revolution. So I've already talked a little bit about this when I mentioned this change in the production of clocks, but clocks were only one element in a much broader development during the late Middle Ages and early modern period in the development of what has been called populux goods. So luxury items that became increasingly accessible to a much wider audience of consumers. This development not only made European products more accessible, but of course also was combined with the rise of what we might call global consumption. So think of tobacco, porcelain, and so on. And one of the, you see a lot of those products depicted in this painting, globes, books, but also glass, as is depicted here on the table. Another item of European production that was very expensive and rare in 1400, but became increasingly accessible also to ordinary consumers in the course of the period. Now, one of the questions that has been raised is where did this consumer revolution start? The term was invented by English historians who talked about the Industrial Revolution. They were thinking of Wedgwood porcelain, for example, in the 18th century. But then other scholars have argued that no, this already happened in Renaissance Italy. Lisa Jardine made that point in a book called Worldly Goods. And of course, Jan de Vries, in his book about the Industrious Revolution, claimed that it happened in the Netherlands, in the Dutch Republic, during the 17th century, during its golden age. And in that same book, de Vries also argued that this consumer revolution was the result of a new found interest in consumer products, which was then translated into a new work ethic, which helped consumers to acquire those consumer products. And this new work ethic, which we find, for example, in the increase of working days during the year, but also in the greater involvement, perhaps, of more individuals, men and women, in the labor market during this period, all of which contributed to the access that ordinary working people had to market products like the ones that I've been discussing so far. Now, the idea of all of these historians is that increased consumer demand led to industrial progress, that the response of producers to this consumer demand was to change the products that they made available to consumers, but that they also changed the way in which those products were produced. And the idea of my paper really is that this response of producers to the increased demand was closely tied to the supply of human capital, because the producers in this period did not have a lot of access to mechanization, but they had to develop their own skills and perhaps also the knowledge that they used to improve both the quality of their products themselves, but also the production processes that they applied to the making of those products. And because we already know that during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, there were very few so-called macro inventions, most of these improvements must have been the result of micro inventions, in other words, of small and often anonymous improvements that were made in craft communities. And those improvements were inevitably, I would argue, related to the development of skills. So we have to look at skills and artisans to investigate these processes. And of course, we can look at top of the range products like Dürer, for example, but my paper will be mostly about what we could call average skills. And so my argument is that the industrial evolution, if such a thing existed, but I would argue that it did, was essentially about the development of skills. In the rest of my paper, I will be looking at how those skills were indeed developed during this period. Now, if we think about skills in the period, we can think about a number of elements, and I'm going to be discussing 5 of those in the rest of my paper. The development of guilds and the way that expert craftspeople were taught, apprenticed, the development of masterpieces. I'm going to be looking at printed instructions, first handwritten instructions, but from the 15th century also printed instructions for craftspeople. I will be talking about the new visual techniques that were applied also, so not only words, but also the techniques they applied, the ways in which these visualizations of craft processes could be reproduced in woodcuts initially, but later in engravings, and then, of course, also the availability of both written and visual sources through printing from the 15th century. So the idea here is that the Industrial Revolution went through a number of stages. Initially, in the late Middle Ages, a sort of foundational stage, then an increase in the speed of development, because you can see here that a lot of these things started to happen really in the 15th century, and then a consolidation phase in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And much of the initial impetus for these developments can be found in a limited number of areas, I would argue, but perhaps this is something for the debate, because you know a lot about Spain, I suspect, and might argue that, oh, wait a minute, similar things are happening there too. But my impression from the literature that I have read is that for a lot of these developments, Italy is the early developer, but that southern Germany and the Low Countries are also picking up these developments quite quickly. And the reason for this, I would argue, is the particular geography of those regions, because Italy, southern Germany, and the Low Countries have one thing in common: they are more urbanized than the rest of Europe, and also their urbanization displays a particular pattern, because it's not concentrated in one or just a few single towns. So it's unlike England, for example, where most urbanization is concentrated in London and very little elsewhere. But in Italy and southern Germany and the Low Countries, you have a lot of different towns which are at one and the same time competitors and collaborators. They are competitors because they try to beat the other towns in developing new gadgets, new techniques, and so on. But they are also collaborators because there is a lot of migration and exchange between those urban centers. So artisans are able to combine new products and new technologies from those various centers. And think again of Albrecht Dürer as somebody who went to all of those places and was able to borrow, as it were, new ideas from all of those places into his own working procedures. So the rest of my paper, I will talk about those 5 bullet points in the beginning, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll be persuaded that this idea of an industrial evolution actually makes sense. So my first piece of evidence, if you will, is the craft guilds. These started in the 12th century, and in the beginning they were regulating just a few elements of the crafts world, but increasingly, really starting in the 14th century, they are also becoming more interested in aspects of training. You find in these guild regulations increasingly items that have to do with apprenticeship. One of the things that they mention is how apprentices can be registered by the guild, and what happens if an apprentice wants to move from one individual teacher to another. Then from the 15th century, we see also how guild regulations start to talk about the examination of apprentices. And by the 16th century, this is a standard element, to the best of my knowledge, in these craft regulations. So you see how increasingly guilds are becoming interested in the training of a new generation of experts, of craftsmen and women, but also how that training is becoming increasingly formalized. And in the volume that Jose contributed to, and that both he and I held up earlier for the camera, it has been demonstrated that this happens across all of Europe, and that even when guilds are not directly responsible for the apprenticeship of crafts, young boys and girls who want to be craftspeople, they still provide a model for that training process and also for the certification of these people. So in a famous paper, Larry Epstein argued in 1998 that guilds are, that the core business of the guilds is really the creation of this sort of human capital. Now, in the more recent literature, this has not been accepted to that radical extent, but human capital formation nonetheless is an important element of what guilds are all about. And they are also, but this is a sideline, it seems a uniquely European element of craft guilds, because we do find craft guilds in other parts of the world, most notably in Asia, but those crafts are not as explicitly preoccupied with training of the new generation. So it looks as if this preoccupation with training is a unique phenomenon in Europe, European craft guilds. Okay, on to my next element. Another innovation in the world of crafts from, let's say, around 1400 is the appearance of texts that are trying to explain how certain products are being made. The initial manuscripts that I will call manuals, but that at the time were known as so-called books of secrets, were preoccupied with the production of food, with military buildings, with metal and medical products. But as time goes on, an increasingly wide range of crafts are also being described in these books. And again, referring back to my example of Albrecht Dürer, he was one of the craftspeople who wrote books of this nature. These books are giving practical advice. So in Dürer's book about human proportions, we see him talking, addressing the reader directly. So in the book, he talks to you as a colleague, as a fellow practitioner, and he says, well, I'm sure you've already discovered a lot of these things for yourself, but maybe it's useful if I do this more systematically. But by all means, combine this with the things you've discovered on your own. So it's all very practical. And in the case of Dürer, we know that fellow artists use this because in Rembrandt's workshop, there was a copy of Dürer's book on human proportions. We know that it was also available in other artist workshops in the Netherlands in the 17th century. And Rembrandt in particular trained quite a few other artists, and one must assume that they browsed in this particular manual from time to time. I'm saying, underlining the point that this sort of book was available in craft workshops, because in the literature, two points are often made. One is that it's really difficult to reproduce these instructions if you want to make a drawing or do some metal work or prepare medications. And the assumption often is that this was deliberate, that the authors were not sharing all their secrets with their readers because they wanted to keep some of it for themselves. I think that there is really a very different problem at stake here. One of the problems for writing about crafts is that many crafts require a lot of hands-on experience. So if you want to learn, this is an example from a context that we know ourselves. If you want to teach your students how to write a thesis, we could of course give them a book. Such books do exist, in which the process is explained. But we all know that the only way that you can learn to write a proper academic text is by simply doing it time and time again. And that the real training is in the practicing and then being corrected by more experienced academics like us. So the other aspect in the literature about these manuals is that they were really written for patrons, for people who wanted to commission certain works, and that the idea was that through the literature they could get some sense of what it meant to make these products. And this could certainly be true, but I would argue that increasingly these manuals were made for producers themselves, for people like Rembrandt, to get some idea and maybe also theoretical ideas about their crafts. Now, one of the interesting thing about these manuals, of course, is that although they start as manuscripts with, by implication, a limited readership, we can increasingly find them in artisan workshops, because as a result of printing technology, which in itself is also part of the Industrial Evolution, texts and pictures become much more easily available. Well, the story is well known. Gutenberg invents movable type in the mid-15th century. As a result of this, there is a rapid increase in the number of titles. At the same time, books become much cheaper, and also at the same time, literacy rates among artisans increase, and all of this creates a sort of perfect storm in which ordinary people, including artisans, have much easier access to information that is relevant for their jobs. And by the 18th century, we see how books with information on science, on technology, on medical subjects become very normal. The number of titles increases rapidly, and by the end of the 18th century, almost 10% of books have those sort of topics. Another aspect of this development is the increasing collaboration between scientists and craftspeople. In the traditional historiography, these worlds are widely apart, but in the modern literature on the history of science, we see lots of interactions between craftspeople and the sciences. And here, in the picture I show here is a wonderful example where people with a scientific background instruct mariners, people who will sail the globe and who will use some of that theoretical knowledge, but who will also provide data for map makers to improve the quality of their geographical information. And as a result of these collaborations, science becomes more evidence-based, but also crafts become more scientific. And one example is the famous Dutch map maker Blauw, who was trained by a famous Danish mathematician, Tycho Brahe, who used his theoretical knowledge to produce increasingly reliable maps and globes in the 17th century that helped Dutch mariners to find their way around the globe. And this was my final picture. So I hope to have persuaded you that all of these developments in the world of science, in the world of the arts, and in the world of crafts together allowed European craftsmen to create new products in novel ways, which prepared the ground for the mechanization of the Industrial Revolution. But the Industrial Revolution stood, as it were, on the shoulders of a much longer process that happened in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And with this, I'll stop sharing my screen. And how do I do that again? Wait a minute. Nope. There must be a way. Stop presenting. There we are. Okay. Yep.
Okay. Thanks for your presentation. Very, very interesting. Preguntas, cuestiones que podéis hacer o levantando la mano y Elvira nos podrá ayudar a traducir si es necesario, o bien podéis escribir en el chat la pregunta que vamos a trasladar a Maarten Prak. O sea que abrimos pues un turno de palabras sobre lo que nos ha planteado Maarten.
Yeah. And let me add that I'm really interested in hearing whether you see confirmation of these developments in Spain, or whether you think all of this happened in very different ways or not at all in Spain. I would really like to add more of the Spanish experience to my story.
¿Quién rompe el hielo?
Pues si queréis yo mismo.
Pues venga.
Bueno, no sé si Elvira, porque yo es que hablo muy rápido y no sé si seré capaz. La última pregunta que nos ha lanzado Maarten para ver qué es lo que puede pasar en otros lugares y en concreto en España, a mí me parece sumamente interesante porque abre la posibilidad a través de su modelo de microinnovaciones de poder integrar esas microinnovaciones que también ocurren en la península ibérica durante la Edad Moderna. En concreto, no creo que estemos muy alejados en algunas partes de, por ejemplo, la difusión a través de manuales. No hemos encontrado muchos, pero hay manuales de sastrería, hay manuales de carpintería, que incluso se difunden por España, pero también llegan a Latinoamérica. En ese sentido, podemos ver puntos en común. Lo que pasa es que el modelo, yo creo, de evolución industrial en España o en la península en general, con sus diferentes reinos y sus diferentes velocidades, creo que es diferente a lo que ocurrió en ese centro que tú planteas, que es Italia, Alemania y los Países Bajos. Aquí creo que no existió una vitalidad industrial tan importante como para poder hacer transformaciones relevantes que al final condujeran a una transformación como la revolución industrial. Bueno, esto simplemente es una reflexión al hilo de lo que ha planteado Maarten para poder integrar en cierto modo lo que ocurre en la Corona de Castilla o en la Corona de Aragón también con lo que ocurre a lo mejor en el centro de Europa. No sé si Maarten a lo mejor puede reflexionar también un poco en voz alta al respecto.
Okay, so basically about your last question of whether we can use what you said in Spain. Well, first, he thinks it's a very interesting question, and he thinks we can kind of apply your model of micro innovations in Spain as well, because there were some books written on, for example, carpenter work, and all that were distributed both in Spain and also in Latin America, some of them. But he thinks that your model that happened in like Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands is kind of different to what happened here, because we like in Spain, there was the industrial world was not as kind of alive, I guess. So it was not enough to lead to an industrial revolution, what was happening in Spain. So that's his point, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the sort of potentially, thank you, Elvira, and thank you, Jose. So one of the things I'm just not sure about in my model is whether if that's what we can call it, there is a not even implicit but explicit subdivision of Europe between the areas leading this process and other regions acting as recipients and being followers, if you will, in this. And the explanation I provide is the urban geography of those regions. Having said that, I am aware of the fact that Spain was, compared to many other European countries, an urbanized region in its own right, that towns played an important part in the public life of Spain, and that for that reason, one might assume processes that were similar to those observed in the Low Countries, in southern Germany and Italy. So that's one way in which I could see this argument develop. At the same time, I am aware that, for example, for the painting industry, which is one that I studied in greater detail, Spain was indeed a recipient of the technology, in inverted commas, imported from Italy and the Low Countries. So famous example, El Greco, who was born in Greece but trained in Venice, came to Spain as did a lot of artists from the Low Countries who were also active in Spain and who stimulated the painting industry in Spain. So I could see one reason why Spain was perhaps an independent center of these innovations. And I know that Jose in his own work has made points about this, the innovative capacity of the craft world in Spain. But I can also see indications for the model where Spain is more a recipient of craft innovations from other parts of Europe. And I'm just not sure what the balance in this argument could be. I see another hand.
Yes, okay.
But
Daniel?
I don't know. Okay.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, first of all, I try to speak in English. Sorry, because my English is not so good as I would like. But I would like to thank Maarten for his very interesting presentation. And in my opinion, the strong point of his speech is this idea of industrial evolution. And in my opinion, is common from Western Europe, because in Spain, in the case of Spain, in my opinion, there was an industrial evolution that not necessarily lead to an industrial revolution. I mean, there were important changes in craft sector. For example, we know something about the silk industry, where we can find some manuals, some craft manuals, for example, in dyeing and sericulture or silk industry. But as Jose said, there are few manuals, but there are. In my opinion, this idea of mobile knowledge or know-how circulation is important because the changes or the craft innovations were known in Spanish cities, at least in the industrial Spanish cities. The difference maybe is the context. No? We know to understand that craft are inside of a general context that probably modified or I don't know exactly how to say, but has a very important influence in the evolution of the craft industries in Spain. But in my opinion, that the model could be with important differences about the context. The model could work also in the Spanish or the Mediterranean context. Obviously, in Italy is more present this kind of innovation, but I think that also in Spain we can see this process. I don't know what you think about.
Okay, yeah, so thank you. And this allows me to talk a little bit about how I see the connection between this process and the Industrial Revolution. So I think one of the important things about innovation is to think about not only the innovators, but also about how innovations are subsequently received in other areas. And my argument would be that although many of these innovations originate in Italy, in southern Germany, and in the Low Countries, they do spread to all of Europe. So that I would be really surprised if you were to tell me that in 1800 there are no watchmakers in Madrid. I think there will be. And they are everywhere. So So these products and the capacity to make them, but also very importantly to repair them, is available everywhere. And I think we have been over-obsessed with the innovation as such, and perhaps not been thinking sufficiently about the distribution of those innovations and the way they are being received in other areas. And this also applies to the Industrial Revolution, because, again, there are two stories here. One possibility is to argue there was something unique about England. And there was probably something unique about England, but it had very little to do with technology. It had much more to do with the availability of coal and the scarcity of wood, and the necessity, therefore, to develop certain machinery for the extraction of coal, the steam engine to pump up water from the coal mines, and so on. I think that if we think about the preceding centuries, it also makes it easier to explain why the Industrial Revolution was taken over by many other countries so quickly. A lot of the technology or the skills that were necessary to work with machinery were already available in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Italy, in Poland, and so on. So yes, there were peculiar reasons in England why the steam engine was first invented there and first applied there. But the fact that this innovation was then picked up by other countries so quickly is probably the result of the fact that you already had this metal industry that was quite advanced. The watchmakers, the people with quite a good understanding of technological processes, of complicated technology, and so on and so forth. So I think by, let's say, reducing the obsession with the first inventors, and by thinking about the distribution of this sort of knowledge to other areas, we get a much more balanced picture of how all of this worked and how Europe was already, as it were, prepared for the Industrial Revolution long before the invention of the steam engine. Still other questions?
Otra pregunta. ¿Quién? Espérate, hay una palabra. Miquel.
Sí, buen día. Good morning, Maarten. I'd like to make two questions. One question deals with informal learning with institutions such as French compagnonnage. Which is the role of these kind of institutions in your model?
Se sent malament. ¿Oís bien?
Okay.
Miquel, se te oye...
No, I heard the question.
Sorry, I will try to repeat it. My first question is which role has informal institutions such as French compagnonnage in your model? And another question deals with my main research on paper making. So actually, there were some attempts of formal knowledge circulation through books in Spain, but from my point of view, these were only attempts, because there were translation of French books that were translated by the enlightened elites, and the real impact to the productive network, from my point of view, was extremely short, late 18th century. This was a point more than a question. The real question was the first question. I apologize for my rusty, I've quite forgotten English.
Don't worry, I completely understood your point. Okay, so let me still say, in response to your second point, that of course the availability of books was not necessarily or does not necessarily imply that people actually read them. And so it changes from location to location. I, for example, investigated a building workshop in Rotterdam in the late 18th century, and one of the things that I was struck by was that this stonemason's workshop had a small library in the workshop of about 10 books coming from all over Europe, from France, from Italy, from the Netherlands itself, with examples of designs, but also theoretical treatises of how the right proportions in a building, etc. So, and I can imagine that similar books were available to paper makers, but of course we don't know whether they read them, yes or no. So I do agree that the fact that these books were available doesn't necessarily imply that they were followed or read, but there was at least the potential. That would be my argument. And I think there are indications that, at least in some cases, they were actually utilized. And why they were more utilized in some regions than in others, well, that is still an open question, I would argue. Your other point about compagnonnage is a very interesting and important one. And I think in general, it is fair to say that it was very important, that there was a lot of, let's say, unorganized travel of artisans going on, and that it must have contributed a lot to the sharing of knowledge and to the distribution of innovative ideas and practices. But unfortunately, it is poorly studied at the moment. The best studied area is the only area in Europe where this was not an informal but a formal institution. And that is in Germany, or the Germanic land. So again, I refer to Albrecht Dürer. In a lot of crafts in Germany, it was not a voluntary but a required part of your training to travel to other cities to make this sort of Tour de France, but in this case, a tour of Germany, to learn about crafts in other places. But I know from my research in the Netherlands that a lot of people made similar trips, even though it was not required. So, for example, in Utrecht, there is an orphanage where, with a special training program for talented pupils, and there is a large administration from which we know that, for example, pupils who were trained as watchmakers were sent to Paris to learn the latest ideas about the making of watches. And this is all informal. Well, it's not informal because it happens through an institution, but it was not a necessary part of your training in the Netherlands, but it still happened. And actually, I think Jose and myself are going to organize a next workshop in which we want to discover more about this. What is the training of these young craft people actually including? And so it is a very important question, and I hope that in a couple of years we can publish a book in which we can answer your question in greater detail.
Molt bé. Una última pregunta para acabar con esta primera intervención, primera parte del seminario. Última cuestión, y si no...
¿Puedo intervenir?
Sí, puedes intervenir. Sí, José.
En la línea de lo que planteaba antes Miquel, las rigideces dentro del mercado de trabajo, en concreto las que pueden venir directamente de los gremios, podían ser una causa, en cierto modo, de la diferenciación entre lo que es ese centro que tú analizas y lo que puede ser la periferia. Puede haber a lo mejor más rigideces en la movilidad de, por ejemplo, de oficiales o de maestros en lo que puede ser la periferia europea con relación al centro, donde puede haber a lo mejor más movilidad de lo que son maestros y oficiales con estas instituciones como el compañonaje.
Yeah, so with regard to what Miquel was saying, is it possible that the fact that the labor market was more rigid in the periphery of what you were saying, and the fact that in the center of Europe it's more flexible, could that be the cause of the difference between the center and the periphery?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question, but I'm not sure if at this point in time we can actually confidently say that the labor market was more rigid in the periphery, if that's the right word at all, than it was in the center. I'm just not sure if that is true. Is that, Jose, the way you read our volume on apprenticeship? Actually, that was not the impression I took away from it. Okay, maybe this is still an issue that we need to debate more. But maybe if this is the final point, I really appreciate these sorts of interactions, and I look forward to having more of them in the future. So thank you for having me, and thank you, Elvira, for contributing to the exchange.
Thank you very much, Maarten. Very, very interesting your contribution, and we agree with your contribution. Thank you.